Hello and welcome everybody to another edition of the Saturdays for the Byzantines podcast. My name is Professor Wren. I am your host. It's been a minute since I've been on here, so I do apologize for that, for a bit of a delay in the new episodes. Most summers, I think, especially if you're a teacher or professor and working academics in any way, you tell yourself you're going to be very productive in the summer and you're going to take on all these projects, and then you get there and you get done with, you finish up maybe half of the things that you say you're going to get into. But we are nevertheless going to continue on here with our series. I'm going to try to push out at least one lecture per week. Some of the other smaller things will come here and there. The midweek videos focusing on more like literature and religious history and that kind of thing. But so today we are going to be talking about the Emperor Basil II. We left off last time with the death of Emperor John Smitskis, who had done a good deal of conquering there. Against both the Bulgarians and especially against the Arabs in the east. Today, Basil II, he is also going to be known for a good amount of military campaigning. However, his conquests are mostly going to be in Europe against the Bulgarians. So Basil II was an ethnic Greek who was born in 958. And he is one of the last great emperors that we are really one of the last great emperors we're going to be talking about on this program. Emperor Alexius Comnenus will probably be the last great Byzantine emperor who we will talk about here. And Basil is sometimes called the Bulgar Slayer, which we'll get into later, and I will use that moniker just because it's really cool. Being known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer is just pretty cool. Now, as we talked about in the last episode, Basil was a child during the reign of the previous two emperors, Emperor Nicephorus Phocas and John Smitskis. In the time of the death of John Smitskis, Basil was about 18 years old. Now, he did have a brother whose name was Constantine. He'll be Constantine the Eighth. But he had very few ambitions to take on the imperial throne, and if you read Michael Sullis, who is a primary source who I'll try to use more in future episodes, I don't have the copy of the text in front of me, but I believe it's a Penguin Classic copy of the text of Michael Sullis. I believe it's 14 Byzantine Emperors is the title. He tells us that essentially Basil and Constantine worked out this deal whereby Basil would be would rule as emperor, and Constantine would rule, essentially have a subordinate role. As I said, he didn't have really any ambitions to take on the position of emperor, and so he served under his brother, and they seem to find this agreement very agreeable. A little redundant there. So during the early years of his reign, Basil also had a chamberlain whose name was also Basil. Now, a chamberlain is essentially the position in a medieval court. A chamberlain was basically like your bedroom guard, right? Because you had your bed chamber, and so the chamberlain was the guy who guarded your bedroom at night, because obviously kings and emperors and dukes and counts, people are often coming for you, carrying out plots for your murder, and so it's good to have someone who you can trust to watch your bedroom while you sleep, because if you're planning on murdering someone, the easiest time to do it is when they're asleep, because they can't see you coming and they're pretty defenseless. So I'll refer to this guy as Basil the Chamberlain, as opposed to Basil II or Basil the Bulgar Slayer, just so we can differentiate between the two guys. And some people do also believe that Basil the Chamberlain was involved in the poisoning of John Smitskis. Some people do believe that John Smitskis died of an unnatural death. However, Basil the Chamberlain, I believe, was a eunuch, so he wasn't able to take the throne. He wouldn't have been able to become emperor himself. Now, the two Basils had a couple of rebels to deal with early on in their joint reign together. Now, the first of these was a guy named Bardas Sclaris, who Basil the Chamberlain had dismissed as the domestic of the East. So the domestic of the East is basically like the top general in the Eastern Front for the Byzantines, and Bardas Sclerus was demoted by Basil the Chamberlain. And so Sclerus gets pissed off with this, basically, and Sclerus rallies the troops in the East who were still loyal to him across much of Byzantine Asia. And he rallies them to his cause before being stopped at the Bosphorus, which is the little bit of water separating Anatolia from Asia, from Europe. And the Byzantine navy stopped them there. Otherwise, he would have been able to march across into Europe and besiege Constantinople. Now, in response to this, Basil the Chamberlain recalled Bardas Phocas, who was a general who was in exile, and he employed him to fight Sclerus. Bardas Phocas, I think, was a nephew of Nicephorus Phocas, but they're from the same family for sure. And Phocas was also not a fan of Sclerus because it is believed that I think Sclerus or someone in Sclerus's family was involved in the plot to assassinate Nicephorus Phocas. I believe that, I'm not sure, I can't remember if it was Sclerus or someone in his family. But either way, Bardas Phocas was not a fan of Sclerus. And the two fought a series of bloody battles, which were somewhat indecisive, but eventually Phocas comes out on top, and Sclerus ended up fleeing to Baghdad, so outside of the Byzantine Empire. And though this internal conflict temporarily weakens the Byzantines, they got back on their feet fairly quickly. Their military and territorial prowess got back to business as usual fairly quickly after this bit of a rebellion. However, then, sometime between 985 and 986, without warning, Basil II has Basil the Chamberlain arrested and Bardas Phocas demoted. After Bardas Phocas was succeeded in his mission with the putting down the rebellion, he's promoted, and then Basil II demotes him when he has Basil the Chamberlain arrested, and I think he has him executed soon after. Now, without much military or administrative experience, Basil II needs some triumphs, some successes, in order to earn himself some credibility, especially after getting rid of Basil the Chamberlain, who had a good track record to his name. So Basil II quickly planned a campaign against the Bulgarians, who had plagued the Byzantines for some time now. You'll remember the Bulgarians, who we used to call the Bulgars, had been raiding Byzantine territory. The Byzantines had been fighting wars with them on and off for decades, if not centuries, at this point in time. Basil II besieges the old Roman town of Serdica, which is controlled by the Bulgarians, but he lacks the supplies to keep to maintain the siege, and he has to withdraw at one point there. And during that withdrawal, he's ambushed and defeated by the Bulgarians, which is pretty embarrassing for him. It's not a great start to his reign, and it seems to kind of, I guess, give him a bad taste in his mouth when it comes to the Bulgarians, as we'll see later on. Now, such a humiliation proved a perfect opportunity for Bardas Sclerus to come out of hiding from Baghdad. Now, at this point, when Bardas Sclerus returns, Basil II quickly repromotes Bardas Phocas to domestic of the East in order to deal with the new threat of Bardas Sclerus. And the hope was that Bardas Phocas would simply put down the rebellion. However, initially, the two Bardases agreed to rule together in opposition to Basil, but they quickly turn on each other, and they fight another series of battles, and Phocas again defeats Sclerus, and as a result, he holds most of Anatolia as well as Crimea. So at this point, Basil's lost control of about half of his empire. And in a desperate appeal, right, Basil's his back is up against the wall. So he turns to the Prince of Kievan Rus, Vladimir, for help. Basil promised Vladimir his sister Anna in marriage if he would convert to Christianity, which Vladimir does, And as well, he asked Vladimir to send military aid to the Byzantines in these trying times. And Vladimir agrees to all this. This is how Vladimir is the first Russian leader to convert to Christianity. And Vladimir also sends Basil 6,000 Viking mercenaries, which came to be known as the Varangian Guard. So if you're into Byzantine history at all, I'm sure you've heard of these guys. These are essentially Viking mercenaries, because the Ryukid dynasty, which Vladimir was part of, was not actually Russian. They were Scandinavian. The Ryukid dynasty, they're the first real Russian dynasty, and they were able to employ a lot of Viking mercenaries, kind of adventurers, to go down and fight with the Byzantines. And actually, I can't remember the name of it was I believe one of the Guiscards, who started the Normans, who was involved in the Norman kingdom in Sicily, because the Norman kingdom in Sicily was also ruled by Vikings. The Normans were Vikings, and one of the guys who was involved in either starting that or running that, again, I forget the name, but I'm pretty sure it might have been Robert Guiscard. He at one point served as a Varangian guard in the Byzantine army, which is pretty cool. The guy I read about that in Lars Brownworth's book on the Normans. It's an interesting story. You guys should check it out. I can't remember the name of the title of the book at the moment, but it's worth looking at. And so the Varangians become a kind of personal bodyguard of the emperor, and the Rusians would replenish the Varangians as needed. So in 989, Basil meets Bardas Phocas in battle near Constantinople with his Varangians, and Phocas is defeated, and Basil and his brother Constantine chase Phocas to, I believe they take him on in Asia, across the Bosphorus. This is in Anatolia, and they chase him to the coastline, the northern coast of Anatolia, where he falls dead in a second battle. And at this point, Basil has secured his throne from all threats. So all people who were threatening the reign of Basil II at this point have been dispatched. Now, the near disastrous years of his early reign made Basil very dour. He's kind of, got a negative look on the world, and honestly, who can blame him? These first couple of years of him being emperor have been pretty rough. I believe also at this point he agrees, or he decides that he's going to remain single. He's not going to take a wife. But Basil also wanted to exact revenge on those who aided his enemies, right? Obviously, he's had a lot of internal conflict, a lot of people within the empire who have attempted to boot him off the throne, and so he wants to exact revenge on that, as well as some people outside of the empire. And one of the initial things he does in order to take revenge on the people who have crossed him is to attack the Iberians up there in what is now today Georgia, basically the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia in the United States, obviously. But many of the Iberians had allied themselves with Sclerus when Sclerus rebelled against Basil, and so Basil goes out there and quickly reasserts Byzantine authority over the Iberians, and actually one of the princes of Iberia, one of the more prominent princes up there, agrees to turn over his lands to the empire when he dies. So as soon as he dies, everything that is under his control is going to be turned over and be Byzantine, not Byzantine like protectorate territory, not a territory that Byzantines are going to have like a suzerain treaty over. It's going to become straight up Byzantine territory. Now, around this time as well, Basil also remembers the law regarding wealthy landowners, which stated that they had to sell their land back to the poor landowners who, many of these wealthy landowners had scalped a lot, I guess scalping would be a decent word for that, but acquired a decent amount of land for themselves in a famine that had happened years before this, and a lot of poor landowners could not afford to pay their taxes and things like that, and so they sold their small farms in order to try to break even. And a lot of these wealthy landowners snatched up the land in that process. And this was a way, even though the law was not often enforced, when it was enforced, Basil used this as a way to weaken some of the noblemen in the empire who either had been or could potentially become a threat to him. So that's another way he kind of exacts revenge on some of his opponents. Now, Basil also wanted to put an end to the Bulgarian threat there in the west, but that project had to be delayed for several years due to the Fatimids attacking the Byzantine client state of the Emirate of Aleppo. Now, you remember the Fatimids are a Shia faction down there in Egypt as well as in Palestine. Byzantines are in conflict with them. They control Jerusalem. They are not around for a terribly long amount of time, but I do find the Fatimids an interesting faction there in this time period. Now, in 999, after the Fatimids have kind of been dealt with here, Basil secures Serdica, which from the Bulgarians, which had been actually an old Roman town. If you remember back to our lectures on the Gothic invasions, for example, Serdica was a very important town in the empire at that time. It was kind of like the center of the Roman Balkans. Around this time as well, the Byzantines lost Dyrrhachium, a city which can also be called Dorazo. But they do manage to occupy most of eastern Bulgaria, so the area is closer to the Black Sea. The following year, the year 1000, the Fatimids agreed to a 10-year truce, which allows Basil to focus all of his attention on the western front and the Bulgarians. And soon after this, Dyrrhachium was retaken, and the Bulgarians were pushed out of northern Greece and remained only in western Bulgaria, at which point Basil agreed to a truce with the Bulgarians as well, which was in 1004. At this point in time, Basil was interested in replenishing the treasury, obviously because he's fought a series of wars at this point, and war is expensive, costs a lot of money. Got to pay all those soldiers and replace the soldiers who die, and equip the soldiers who need equipment. And so, in an effort to work a different angle on the landowner front, because a lot of the emperors are very concerned about trying to check the power of these landowners again, who scalped a lot of land there and are growing in power, and so he enacts a law which stated that wealthy landowners had to pay the taxes of their poorer neighbors who could not afford to pay their taxes. Now, obviously, this is going to be very unpopular, and you know. It is fairly unfair to say, you know, can you imagine now if the government came to you and said, hi, your neighbor can't afford to pay his own tax, so we're going to charge you double tax this year so you can pay your taxes and his taxes. Obviously, this was not a popular thing for Basil to do, but it was effective. It did produce more revenue, and it did help him check some of the power of these noblemen. Again, even despite the fact that this would not have been a very popular thing to do. Around this time, a little while later, Basil agrees to renew his truce with the Fatimids, but not with the Bulgarians. Apparently, the Bulgarians were just kind of on his shit list. And so in 1014, Basil's army managed to ambush and capture about 1,400 Bulgarians in a battle. And Basil might have been willing to release the prisoners had the remaining Bulgarians not attacked his camp soon after. I believe it was like during the night. It was like a sneak attack. And Basil was very upset about this. He fell into a fit of rage and ordered the 14... I'm sorry, I think I said 1,400. It was 14,000 Bulgarians he captured. And so Basil orders, after that attack on his camp, Basil ordered the 14,000 Bulgarian captives to be blinded. The Byzantines were not fond of executing captives. I think for like religious reasons. With the exception, there were 100 men who were blinded only in one eye, so they could lead the rest of the blinded Bulgarian prisoners back home. I guess the half-blind leading the blind, I guess you could say. Now, when Samuel, the Bulgarian emperor, saw this mass of blind prisoners marching back to his castle or whatever, reportedly Samuel took a heart attack and died. He was so shocked and scared by this, he just had a heart attack and collapsed. Now, following the brief reign of Gabriel, the Emperor Gabriel there in the Bulgarian Empire, I guess it's so small, I kind of have an issue with calling it an empire. But either way, the Bulgarian Emperor John offered to become a Byzantine client state. Again, John follows Gabriel, but only to plan to attack Dyrrhachium soon after he makes this treaty to become a Byzantine client state. Now, Basil was very upset by this. He was enraged at John's chicanery, and he marched to John's remaining stronghold, the last little castle that the Bulgarians had left there in western Bulgaria. Now, considering John died during the siege of Dyrrhachium, his wife and remaining courtiers agreed to surrender to Basil. And so then, after Western Bulgaria surrenders to Basil, he turns it into a duchy, a Byzantine duchy. It's not like a client state or anything, or he doesn't subjugate them. It's just incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. Don't have to worry about it anymore. These conquests returned the Byzantine borders in the Balkans to what they were in the 7th century, many, many years ago. So the 600, that was just a little after Justinian there. And after the Bulgarians were dispatched, the Serbs and the Croats also submitted themselves to the Byzantines as client states. I believe that is the first mention we have here of anything about Serbs and Croats, who will come up more as time goes on. They're not wildly important factors in a lot of what we'll be talking about here, but we will talk about, for example, when the Serbs and the Croats are conquered by the Ottomans later on, which is too bad. They're especially the kingdom of Serbia was really just developing at that point in time, and they were sort of a fledgling state, and unfortunately they got whacked early on by the Ottomans. Now, over the next 2 years, the Georgians, Armenians, and Fatimids all invaded the empire, a series of invasions which were quickly repelled. And during this defense, also, Basil continues blinding captives, which appears to become his trademark. I guess maybe he wouldn't have been as aptly named Basil the Bulgar Slayer as he would have been named Basil the Blinder, because he does seem to be fond of this. But he does defeat the Bulgarians, so I can understand why he's called the Bulgar Slayer. And most of his campaigning was done against the Bulgars. Now, in 1025, Basil began planning the conquest of Sicily from the Arabs. However, before he could embark on that campaign, Basil died suddenly of natural causes at the age of 67. Basil's reign lasted for nearly 50 years. If you count, because kind of the way this works is the time when he's ruling with Basil the Chamberlain is not technically count. I guess it's kind of separate from the rest of his reign. But if you count those years together, it's actually over 50 years. So Basil II is actually the longest reigning emperor, Roman, Byzantine, across all of them. He going all the way back through to Augustus. Basil is the longest reigning emperor, which is really impressive. I mean, he's an impressive guy. He gets a lot done during his reign. And his military conquests were greater than any emperor since Justinian. Now, while they were not quite as grand as Justinian, it's still notable. It's still significant. And he also, to his credit, Basil leaves the imperial treasury with 14.4 million numismata in it. Numismata is like the kind of standard currency there for the Byzantine Empire. And so that's it for the lecture today. I know this was a bit of a shorter one, but I kind of wanted to split up kind of our golden age of Byzantine history here. I felt, because Basil reigns for so long, it'd be worth giving him his own episode. So if you've made it this far in the video, please make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. Also, make sure to find, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play, please give us a follow. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please make sure to give us a 5-star review. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at Professor Wren, where I post updates about the show and other, like history memes that I think are fun. and I share them with you guys. And sometimes as well, viewers will send submissions of memes to me, which I share on my story. So if you have something you want to send to me and I can share it with our viewers and listeners, I can do that as well. So thanks for listening, everybody. Again, sorry this is a little short and sorry it's a little late, but such is the schedule. I'll try to get more back on schedule in the coming weeks here, but like I said, that's all I have for y'all today, and I'll see y'all next time.